The big story of the moment as Ukraine calls for their own urgent meeting with Russia to discuss the escalating tensions on the border. Boris Johnson says he's going to be meeting world leaders in the coming days. He's going on a whistle-stop tour of Europe amid fears that a really big war could break out at really any hour.
Now, despite the growing tension in the region, the UK's Armed Forces Minister has insisted British troops will not be sent into Ukraine, though, of course, there will be other support and training perhaps involved. James Heappey, good morning to you. You join us now live.
Good morning.
Good morning. Given the Americans' intelligence view that Wednesday could be the day, or perhaps, we were just talking about the Winter Olympics there, perhaps when the Winter Olympics in China end, maybe that would be the point of invasion. Why is it that Boris Johnson today is still choosing to go up to Scotland and Northern England on a levelling up chat when actually this really important international issue is right on his doorstep?
Well, look, the Prime Minister has been engaged in diplomacy and being briefed on the security situation all weekend. He remains in comms with us back in London as he goes off around the UK to continue with his business as Prime Minister. I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. In fact, I'm certain that they're not. He has got a series of calls that he will continue to make. And of course, there is the NATO Defence Ministers meeting, which heads of government and heads of state are now attending on Wednesday.
Well, he missed a call, didn't he, with Putin during the whole Partygate scandal because he was too busy defending himself in the Commons. I mean, you know, the German Chancellor is on his way to Kiev today. It does seem that Boris Johnson, you know, and Ben Wallace has shortened his own half-term holiday with his family to come back because it's such an important issue. I still struggle to understand why going to Scotland today is the top thing on Boris Johnson's agenda.
Well, I think that the phone calls that have happened over the weekend, the decisions that have been made around changing travel advice, around how we will balance our forces, most crucially taking them out of Ukraine to avoid any risk of miscalculation and therefore unnecessary escalation. Those are decisions that have already been taken. The Prime Minister continues to monitor the situation carefully, but the business of government must continue, and that's what he's doing. It's also why he has a team of people in the Foreign Office and in the Ministry of Defence and in the National Security Secretariat in the Cabinet Office who are able to watch this on a minute-by-minute basis. And obviously the Prime Minister is engaged when there are prime ministerial decisions to be taken.
All right, you're choosing your words very carefully, as you should on something as sensitive as this. One wonders if your colleagues, including the Prime Minister, have the same care. I mean, obviously we had Boris getting into seriously hot water for the Jimmy Savile remarks vis-à-vis Keir Starmer and all of that. And then this interview in yesterday's Sunday Times with Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, talking about a whiff of Munich, about the current situation between Ukraine and Russia. And it made most people think, because when we say Munich in this country in relation to war, we're talking about appeasement. It's shorthand for a policy of appeasement. And obviously the Ukraine and other countries involved in this said, whoa, just a minute. We're not in appeasement mode here. We're in diplomacy mode. And so there had to be this usual backtracking, which it seems to be a hallmark of this government, saying, no, that's not what he meant. He meant that Russia wasn't to be trusted. I mean, surely someone at his level, the Defence Secretary, should be choosing his words with a great deal more care in such a volatile situation as this.
Well, Richard, I think that Ben has been very effective in his use of language. If you think about the press conference in Moscow at the end of a very challenging visit and some very robust but constructive meetings with his opposite number, Minister Shoigu, Ben was answering questions from the media from all over the world, showing a complete understanding of all of the various treaties that exist and that could be built on. In the interview that you refer to, he was offering a reflection as a man who has been invested in this, not just for the last few days and weeks as it's made the news in the UK, but for months now, as he has been working tirelessly to avoid conflict in Ukraine and to support the Ukrainians in their preparations for what might happen. And he was expressing frustration at the futility of the diplomacy.
And in terms of British troops, they're in Eastern Europe, but not obviously in Ukraine. Is your thought that their primary objective will be to perhaps support Ukrainian training or whatever that might entail, but also about perhaps a refugee crisis, a new one that might emerge from Ukraine into Poland and into neighbouring countries? Is that where British troops will be working at their hardest in managing that influx of people fleeing potentially a war zone?
Well, I think there's three bits to it. So firstly, to the first half of your question, no, UK forces will not continue to play a part in training Ukrainian troops in Ukraine. That is something that we need to communicate very clearly to Moscow. Whilst the situation in Ukraine itself is grave, there is a far graver risk of miscalculation leading to escalation across the whole of the continent, and therefore clarity of message and being very clear about what the UK will and won't be doing is very important right now. You're absolutely right to say that there will be a job of work to support what I suspect, if this were to happen, would be a very large number of people that would head across the border into neighbouring countries, and NATO, the European Union and other allies will need to be in a position to support them. But then the third part of it, which wasn't in your question, but probably is the more meaningful thing that UK troops will be doing over the months and years ahead, is one of the things that President Putin claims to want to achieve through all of this is to renegotiate Euro-Atlantic security and to push NATO away from Russia's borders. If he crosses into Ukraine, NATO as an alliance will show its resolve by reinforcing its eastern borders.
All right.
So Putin will achieve exactly what he says he doesn't want to achieve by going into Ukraine. We need to be very clear with him that that will be the consequence.
Well, indeed. And indeed, when Second World War Germany invaded Belgium and France and Holland, it was actually the beginning of the end for them. And 4.5 years later, they were losing the war. 2.5 years later, they were beginning to lose the war. So we take that point in a historical context. Let me ask you this. There's a growing murmur about this, certainly in the British media, that Putin's problem, and putting ourselves in his shoes, playing devil's advocate for a second, setting aside the threat of invasion, is that he's deeply worried that the Ukraine will join NATO. In the same way that President Kennedy was very worried about the Russians putting missiles on Cuba. Strategically, it doesn't make much difference, but it's very, very symbolic. We don't need the Ukraine to join NATO. NATO is quite powerful enough as it is. Do you think that diplomatically a compromise might be reached if we were to agree that Ukraine doesn't join NATO for the foreseeable future, and that would address Russian concerns about another NATO country and NATO troops right up on its border, in the same way that America would be concerned if Russian troops were in Mexico or Cuba? Do you think that's a compromise that we might be able to reach?
Well, Richard, implicit in your question is a view that Ukrainian sovereignty should be compromised for the purposes of reaching a diplomatic solution. I and the UK government are uncomfortable with that. Ukraine has the sovereign right to choose whichever alliance it wants to be a member of. Now, if Ukraine, in its own sovereign way, chooses to say that in the interests of our immediate term security, we're willing to make a compromise on our ambition to join NATO, then of course we support Ukraine as a sovereign country in making that compromise.
I'll take that as a yes then.
Because if by contrast Ukraine were to turn around and say that it wants to stand by its commitment to its ambition to join NATO, we would support that too. That's what sovereignty is.
Would be frightfully unhelpful though, wouldn't it, if they did that? Very unhelpful in the current situation.
Well, Richard, only if you were willing to set the conditions in which, in international diplomacy, one country can effectively bully another out of a sovereign choice. Ukraine will make the diplomatic choices it makes. The UK, as one of its best friends in the world and one of the most enthusiastic supporters of its sovereignty, will support it with whatever position it chooses to take.
That's very clear. Point taken. Thank you very much indeed.